In this video, we're going to give you an overview of the scenario-based strategic planning process. There's 8 steps to this process, and they closely align with and follow the 8 tasks of the innovation process. We also use the human values and innovation styles models to facilitate and energize this process.
The scenario-based strategic planning process is actually, paradoxically, more innovative and more creative, more comprehensive, and yet non-traditional. It's more conservative, and yet it gives you, and most importantly, a very creative way of thinking about the future of your organization.
The value of this particular process is that you can engage a wide range of people in the process, and that's what corporations are needing to do more and more now, is to get a much wider range of input in their strategic planning process. It's also extremely creative and innovative, and yet, as William said, paradoxically, it's very conservative in its risk. It actually provides the ability to be flexible across different scenarios of uncertainty.
And that actually brings us to 2 important distinctions to make, and that is the difference between a scenario and a strategy. A scenario is that set of conditions that are developed by various driving forces outside of your control, and those conditions are what you and your competitors would both face. A strategy is actually your proactive response to that set of conditions.
The scenario-based strategic planning process is, if we contrast it with the forecast-based process, which is the most widely used, this is where we actually have a myth on this that stumps our audiences every time. The myth is forecast-based strategic planning is the least risky type of planning.
Right. And of course, forecast-based planning is really dependent upon your assumptions about the future and the trends that you're monitoring. And you basically, though, bet your company on your trend analysis and your set of assumptions, and you hope that they're right, because if they're not, you're lost.
The forecast-based type of planning uses a lot of controls to make sure you're on track for going from A to B, whereas the scenario-based strategic planning process uses more of learning and mid-course corrections, more like flying an airplane, a guidance system to be sure you're on track to be going in the direction that you want to go, and have flexibility and mid-course correction when you need it.
Another point that contrasts them is that forecast-based planning is very often a numbers-driven exercise, whereas scenario-based planning is more holistic. It really looks at systems and how systems forces interact. And again, by outlining different scenarios, which encompass the sense of uncertainty that you have about the future, you can plan across that uncertainty and know that if one condition starts to change, you've already got a strategy ready for that.
Peter Schwartz, who's the grandfather of the scenario-based strategic planning process, he worked with Royal Dutch Shell in the late 60s and 70s. I really love this quote of his. He says, "Scenario planning is not a tool for making predictions. The future remains as unpredictable as ever. Rather, it is a tool for better decision making." He also says it's a tool for better communication about the future.
Jay Ogilvy was a compatriot of Peter Schwartz, and talks about that scenario planning as a way to have a conversation also about the values. What kind of future do we want to create? That we're not just reacting to conditions of the future, we're actually helping to shape them, if you will, the best we can.
And that's a key to scenario-based strategic planning as well. It's really taking a much stronger position at how are we going to create the future. That's why it's an innovation process, because it's a proactive look at creating your future.
So now the strategic planning process using scenarios actually follows the 8 tasks of the innovation process. And it has an inhale and an exhale. In the inhale, it starts with the first step where you identify a core decision you're having to make, and then also identifying what are the consequences that could follow that decision in terms of being successful or not successful. really what's at stake in making this decision.
The third step is where you look to see what gives us confidence that we can actually fulfill this strategy. That's where we use human values, and we look at the values and the knowledge and the skills and the attitudes of the organization that give us confidence to create and actually follow through with this strategy. The fourth step is where we actually create the scenarios. We'll create 3 or 4 scenarios of the future, and we'll also identify the driving forces.
In step 5 is where you start to develop a strategy for each scenario. And so that if you have 3 scenarios, you'll end up with 3 distinct strategies appropriate to that scenario. And then in task 6, you'll take that diversity of strategies and begin to look across them into a positioning strategy that positions you across the uncertainty. You're not just picking, okay, this scenario, this strategy, but how do you position across the uncertainty so that if a scenario changes from A to B, you've already got a strategy in place for how you convert and shift what you're doing.
The 7th step is to develop your implementation strategy for your implementation plan for your strategy. And step 8 is where you develop the measures. How are you going to measure how you're doing along the way? Now, one thing I want to point out, notice that sometimes we said task and sometimes we said step. And that's because we were going between innovation process and the scenario process. The innovation process itself, we refer to the 8 tasks because that one is quite organic. It's not so much of a linear process. The scenario-based strategic planning really is a process where you do want to go step by step, and so we do refer those to steps. But when we're going back and forth between the process and the scenario, we get confused between steps and tasks.
So now there's a number of terms that you'll be using in this process. We talk about mission and vision because, again, there's very different definitions of what a mission is versus a vision, what are scenarios versus strategies, what are business models versus a business plan. And so we've carefully defined those so that there's not a confusion in the group that you're having to participate with you in terms of what you're asking them to think about.
So some of our definitions may be different than what you're used to, and again, that's why we wanted to define them so that you know what we mean by them when you're going through the process.
Now, there are different types of thinking. We're talking about strategic thinking here, for example. What is regular thinking? Well, we all know it's about conceiving and comprehending ideas and thoughts.
It's all about those thoughts in your head that you wish you could turn off at night when you go to sleep.
Right. Then there's tactical thinking, which is what we tend to do every day at work. You know, how am I going to get this done by 6 o'clock tonight or finish this project? There's innovative thinking, which is how you think about doing something new, better, or different, and something more ingenious or original, if you will. And finally, there's strategic thinking, which is where you're looking at the long-range blueprint, the game plan, if you will, of what you want to be doing to create your future. And we'll see that innovative thinking can actually feed into strategic thinking quite nicely.
We'll be using all the types of thinking, mostly innovative and strategic thinking, but we'll also do some tactical thinking as well along the way.
Now, the innovation styles can actually help stimulate that strategic thinking by using the core compass questions of the innovation styles. When you're looking at a strategic plan, you start to ask what ideas could give you an ideal long-term solution? What ideas could modify or simplify or refine what you've already done? What ideas could give you something radically new and different? What ideas for experimenting could be combined to give you different ideas and perspectives?
You can also take the generic innovation styles questions and customize them to stimulate strategic thinking. So the visioning style would ask, how would we like to be ideally positioned in the future, 2 years, 5 years from now, wherever the future is of the strategy that you're planning? The modifying style of thinking would ask, how can we leverage our core competencies, the strengths that we have now, how can we leverage them and take them forward? The exploring style of innovative thinking would ask, how can we change the rules of competition? How can we change the game altogether? The experimenting style of innovative thinking would ask, how can we synergize our partnerships, our technologies? How can we bring things together and combine them and do something new with them?
So by the time you complete a scenario-based strategic planning process, you'll find that you've developed a positioning strategy across the uncertainty that gives you not only what to monitor in terms of driving forces, but also how to shift if those driving forces have changed. You'll also find that you've developed business models and business plans that make the entire strategy planning process actionable, all the time having used multiple scenarios. As we said earlier, it's paradoxically a non-traditional and yet more conservative way of developing your strategic plans.
And a conservative way of spreading your risks
Yes.
across the uncertainty of the future. So you're spreading your risk of the uncertainty while you're actually engaged in consciously creating your future.